So today's presentation was written last night after the opening ceremony, and I was up way too late putting this together, as some of you might know. So please bear with me. You may be able to spot me in some of the background of the presentation, even though it is about personal histories. It isn't about mine, which means at least I don't have to talk about myself. Come to think of it, that might have been a little bit easier. Either way, my presentations are a bit backwards. Not long ago, I spoke about the role of archaeology in the 21st century, or in terms of the theme of this conference, it's growth. Now I'm going to be addressing the theme of origins and essentially why they matter. Or at least, anyways, moving on. Make sure I get the slideshow moving. There we go. In today's presentation is going to at least roughly follow this outline. I'm going to start off with the big picture. Why do disciplinary histories matter? I may even say something about why they matter to archaeology, but we'll see if I get to that. The thing is, everything in this talk is interrelated, more like a spider web of thought than a linear path. From this discussion of why histories of archaeology matter, I will focus on the role of personal histories in constructing those disciplinary histories. I'll share an anecdote or two, and then we will move on to discussing the value of semi-structured interviews, what they can teach you about personal histories, and how they can provide insight into the production of archaeological knowledge, or how we know what we know. I'll finish off with some closing remarks, which will focus on the key things I want to take away from this presentation, and I might go off on some tangents along the way. We shall see. Okay, so why do disciplinary histories matter? I'm going to start off on a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. There is a point to it. I recently read an article entitled "The 60-Year-Old Scientific Screw-Up That Helped COVID Kill." The article was just absolutely fascinating. I was drawn in. Basically, it gets to the heart of the debate over whether COVID spread by droplets or by aerosol. Essentially, whether it was spread by surfaces and close contact or whether it was airborne. The difference has huge consequences for which safety precautions health professionals need to implement. The prevailing wisdom held that the line was between aerosol and droplets was drawn at 5 microns. Anything larger than 5 microns was droplets, less than 5 microns was airborne. However, a researcher noted that the physics for that was just plain wrong and didn't match the data. However, it was really a really long-standing cutoff point in the world of infectious diseases. But where exactly did that division come from? It was a bit of a mystery. A grad student was finally able to figure out what happened. The mistake was made in the 1960s, but it is traced back to the 1940s. A researcher discovered that the droplet aerosol dichotomy pivoted around 100 microns, not 5, back in the 1940s, but nobody believed him because they thought it really harkened back to ideas about bad air or the miasma theory in medicine. Studies around the same time looking at health hazards of working in mines showed that the mucus in the nose and throat were really good at catching particles bigger than 5 microns, while smaller ones got into the lungs. This was important for biological warfare, which became something of an obsession in the 1950s, as it meant that to really infect people, you needed to aerosolize it into particles smaller than 5 microns to bypass the body's main defenses. The same guy who discovered the droplet aerosol dichotomy at 100 microns in the 1950s designed an experiment to test the 5 micron theory using tuberculosis, or to test the experiment of on the spread of disease with a 5 micron use of tuberculosis. Greater than 5 microns, the rabbits in the test didn't catch it. Smaller than 5 microns, they became very ill. But that has to do with the size of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is smaller than 5 microns, and it has to get into the lungs to infect you. So that 5 micron limit was really important for that. The researcher, a man named Wells, died the month after publishing his study on tuberculosis. Because the study focused on tuberculosis, which had a 5 micron threshold to reach deep into the lungs, his earlier research regarding the 100 micron limit between droplet and aerosol got left behind and forgotten. At the time, there was a tuberculosis epidemic, and that was the focus of the CDC. But the research on tuberculosis got applied to a broader threshold for other diseases, and has probably been responsible for inadequate guidance for nearly 60 years, all because the history of the research hadn't been fully taken into account. Now, this is an extreme example, but it shows how cursory explorations of disciplinary history can perpetuate misconceptions for decades. Okay, back to why do archaeological disciplinary histories matter? I can go down the theoretical route and say something like they matter because disciplinary histories, as narratives of past inquiry, are part of the disciplinary structures that inculcate practitioners and provide criteria not only for acknowledging and validating knowledge production, but also for accrediting investigation practices and research agendas, or that histories of archaeological inquiry influence the actions and interpretations of archaeologists that archaeologists subsequently make while simultaneously reflecting the disciplinary and individual epistemologies and ontologies underlying their production. And I have said those things before, but beneath all that theory are some very basic ideas. First, we use histories of archaeology to situate our research, to give it context. Why do we do this? Well, it is a way of acknowledging our elders, those who have come before us, and the research they've done, even if we think it is all just rubbish. Situating our research also gives us an opportunity to demonstrate that we know what we are doing. We can show that we are using trusted techniques that meet a set standard. Second, they provide a baseline of knowledge from which we interpret what we see in the field. It wasn't until projectile points from Canada were brought back to Scotland in the 18th century that they realized that what they had been calling elf stones were actually made by people in the past. They had no point of reference before then. Third, good disciplinary histories put past research into its contemporary context so that we can understand some of the motivations and concerns that influence particular interpretations. Finally, as you can see by this slide, I wanted to discuss the communities we as archaeologists build. The experience of conducting fieldwork, often in remote areas where you spend all day and night with your colleagues, creates bonds, similar to kinship. We talk about our cohorts, our groups, our archaeological families and roots. Some of us have even done almost lineage studies through our supervisors to trace our archaeological pedigrees. The- these all influence how we interpret and the materials we encounter in the field, and none of it is done in isolation. We do it as a community. The network of relationships and how that influences the choices we make is why personal histories matter. So we will move on to the next slide on personal histories. For this slide, I'm going to focus on Vera Gordon Child. I've put on the screen some of the things you might know about him. I suspect that of you have read many, if any, of his books, but you might have had to learn about him as an undergrad or heard of him. He is even mentioned in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Like many of you, I remember hearing his name as an undergraduate. I might have even remembered that he had something to do with the idea of archaeological cultures. Beyond that, I couldn't have told you much until I was doing graduate school. I have also put up here, just to give a bit of flavor of how he was viewed at the time, a poem written by about Child's famous book, The Dawn of European Civilization, by his successor as the Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, the archaeologist Stuart Piggott, who features in the recent film The Dig. I'll quickly read the brief excerpt from the poem on the screen. When sounds of verbal conflict fill the air, and archaeologists, that curious few, debate some problem or in turn prepare to build whole cultures on the slightest clue, then, soon or late, is heard the speaker who says to the questing novice, shy, forlorn, and diffident, I can't explain to you. You'll find it in a footnote in the dawn. Prince, to your learnings be all honor due. How will eternity treat man, its spawn? Leaving the past, do you then turn and view man's end as but a footnote in his dawn, to his dawn? The story I really wanted to tell here is concerning what Bruce Trigger described in his biography of Child as a glaring shortcoming. That is Child's failed failure to ascribe Scarabray to the Neolithic and instead ascribe it to the Iron Age. Understanding Child's personal history and his relationships really can change how that shortcoming is viewed. First, it is worthwhile to note that Child was Australian and he had spent some time working in politics. When he was appointed to the newly created Abercrombie Chair of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh in 1927, he was a complete outsider with limited practical archaeological experience. But one but he did have one major and influential publication, The Dawn of European Civilization. At the suggestion of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, Child was quickly appointed by the Office of Works to supervise the preservation activities at Skara Brae. Note, these were not initially excavations. They were preservation activities. They were trying to preserve the site from being eroded into the sea. Child was also elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1927, that same year. At the same time, the gentleman in the center of the picture on the right, John Graham Callender, which you can see right here, was the director of the National Museum of Antiquities in Edinburgh and the editor of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland's Proceedings, the preeminent journal in Scottish archaeology at the time. It is an important thing to note this. In 1929, the secretary of the Orkney Antiquarian Society, Hugh Warwick, attributed Skara Brae to the Hugh Marwick, yeah, uh, attributed Skara Brae to the period before the Iron Age. When it came time for Child to publish his results from the work at Skara Brae in 1931, Callender was still the editor of the Proceedings. In the same issue of the journal in which Child published his results, Callender himself wrote an article ascribing Skara Brae to the Iron Age. What was Child to do? He knew that Marwick had already ascribed it to the Stone Age, and he himself thought it dated to the Neolithic. I would argue that for political reasons, Child caved to the pressures of the archaeological community in Edinburgh and followed Callender's lead in ascribing it to the Neolithic. But he did so in very couched language. I should also mention that Callender was participating in a number of excavations across Orkney during the 1930s, specifically of Neolithic chambered tombs on the island of Rousey. He was a rival archaeologist who was a prominent figure in the small archaeological community that was Scottish archaeology at the time. He might have been what might call today a frenemy of Gordon Childs. According to Pigott, when in 1936 he suggested to Child that Skara Brae was Neolithic based on a comparison with the pottery recovered from Woodhenge, Child quickly accepted Pigott's argument, writing back, most convincing and guaranteed to make Callender foam at the mouth. This anecdote really demonstrates how the community of archaeologists in Edinburgh influenced archaeological interpretations and thereby influencing how people thought about the Orcadian Neolithic for decades to come. Should also note that by following Callender's lead, Child alienated many of the local Orcadian archaeologists and patrons, and he didn't get back there until after Callender died. So, why conduct semi-structured interviews? So the short answer to the first question on this slide, uh, which is the only question on the slide now, is to get to the types of personal histories I was just talking about, you have to do these kind of interviews. To really learn about the communities that did the archaeology, you have to talk to them about it. You have to learn about those relationships that don't really show up in archaeological reports. During the course of my PhD research, I heard so many stories and found out a ton about the connections and relationships between archaeologists that have worked in Orkney. It is honestly hard to pick a story to tell. The one I am going to tell is how Colin Richards, pictured in the yellow shirt on the right, became the expert on the Orcadian Neolithic. So I would have drawn a family tree or something to help with this, but I ran out of time, and they're kind of convoluted anyways. It would have involved lots of swirls and arrows and stuff like that. Anyways, Colin was my supervisor for my MA and just never responded to my request to do an interview with him for my PhD, which is not uncommon for Colin. He was always hard to get a hold of for anything. So this was not unexpected on my part. I knew this. I had worked with him before. So the only way I got this story about how he got to where he was in Orcadian archaeology was through interviewing the people who had been around him, who were available to do interviews with me. First off, archaeological investigations into the Arcadian Neolithic changed after the passing of Child. Not to say that nothing happened, plenty was going on, but academic interest disappeared. That all changed with Anna Ritchie, pictured in the center. She was one of the best people I interviewed, and I can't thank her enough for that. Anyways, she and her husband Graham went up to Orkney to excavate a site in a family friend's backyard. They were grad students. They thought this would be an interesting excavation. They wanted to see what there was there. The excavation went so well, the publication was so well received, she subsequently got asked to come back and work on another site. At the same time, David Clarke got hired at the National Museum of Scotland to help reinterpret the material Child had excavated at Skara Brae while he was finishing up his PhD under Stuart Piggott at the University of Edinburgh. But he had originally studied at Cardiff with Leslie Alcock, who was by that time at the Glasgow University. To help interpret the materials from Skara Brae excavated by Child, Anna and David ended up leading excavations there in 1972. David continued working there until 1974, and Anna went on to other projects. In 1977, David went back to do some final excavations at Skara Brae and recruited students from Glasgow after getting recommendations about them from Leslie Alcock. One of those students was Neil Sharples, who was one of my other key informants for this tale. That same year, 1977, David sent some of his students to check out a possible Neolithic settlement at the links of Notland, and they managed to find it. He then started excavations there in 1978, bringing up Nick Card, Neil Sharples, and other students to work at the site. They recovered a ton of grooved-ware pottery from the site. One of Leslie Alcock's students, John Barrett, finished his PhD at Glasgow in 1976, and then taught at the University of Leeds with Ian Hodder from 1976 to 1977. From 1977 to 1981, Barrett ran an excavation at Cranbourne Chase with Richard Bradley. Now, Neil Sharples was at Cranbourne Chase during one of those seasons of excavation, and there he met Mike Parker Pearson, one of Ian Hodder's students at Cambridge. This was part of how the whole post-processual movement kind of got really going. Now, Richard Bradley, who was running it with John Barrett, was Colin Richards' supervisor for his postgraduate research. Colin did some really great research on grooved ware from Durrington Walls near Stonehenge, which got published with Julian Thomas, where they analyzed kind of deposition and style and a whole bunch of stuff. But he was never at Cranbourne Chase as far as I could find out. He subsequently went on to do his PhD with John Barrett after Barrett had returned to Glasgow in 1980. Initially, Colin's plan was to analyze the grooved ware from the links of Notland at the National Museum of Scotland as part of his PhD, arriving there in 1982, which is also where Neil Sharples was working at the time. As Neil Sharples put it, the pottery from links of Notland was quite difficult to work with because it was all mashed up. So Colin had to come up with a different plan for his PhD. And at the time, he was quite interested in the analysis Ian Hodder had done at the end of Symbols and Action, and therefore refocused his research to look at the, and I quote, symbolic and practical qualities embodied in Neolithic architecture. To do this, he designed a field walking project to look for additional settlement sites in Orkney, which started in 1984. In December of 1984, on one of the last days of fieldwork, Colin's dog Rufus, yes, his dog, is credited with discovering, and I put that in quotes, discovering the Neolithic village at Barn House. The excavations at Barn House launched Colin's career and became the focus of his PhD. Colin has now spent the better part of the last 40 years working on large, multi-year, multi-site research projects in Orkney. However, he had help from a well-connected and influential archaeological community supporting him. Understanding who, where, and why that community supported him requires understanding the personal networks and communities involved in doing research in Orkney over multiple decades and multiple generations. Colin was privileged by having been part of such a community of archaeologists. Had he been an outsider like Child was when he arrived in Edinburgh, he may never have become the leading archaeologist of the Orcadian Neolithic. Okay, closing thoughts, because I'm almost out of time. I want to just close with what is on my slide here. Histories of archaeology matter, particularly the personal histories of archaeologists. We are a community of archaeologists. Nothing is achieved alone. To understand where we are going as a discipline, we have to know where we've been. Don't dismiss earlier interpretations as simply wrong without understanding the context in which they were made. If you understand that context, you might be able to understand what they were trying to tell us. Finally, I have to thank all of the archaeologists who shared their stories with me during my PhD research. I couldn't have done it without them, and I truly mean it. So, thank you, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.